to the go. Well, welcome again to this second block of our Juris North Congress about Kelsen 2021. We had before a keynote speech from Dr. Maris Kopke and a paper presentation from Dr. Anna Tasklin, the UK and Spain and Canberra, Australia. We have very different time zones. Many thanks to all of you. And again, from the previous blog, we know Feng, Dr. Wei Feng is poorly in hospital. So thank you very much, for all the effort, all these people, keynotes and our speakers have put throughout this Congress. And in particular to Jorge, who will be joining us, Jorge Fabra Zamora from Toronto, and Gonzalo Rosas, our co-hosts. Gonzalo in Germany, Kiel, and Jorge in Toronto. Without any further ado, and before I forget as well, because I know they've been in touch, Dr. Stanley Paulson sends his apologies, and he asked me in particular to mention this to all of you, and because I'm recording again, I'm going to repeat myself. Bonnie had an accident days ago. She's currently in hospital. That's why Dr. and Professor Stanley Paulson cannot be with us today and tomorrow because he's right now with Bonnie. I think that's all. Gonzalo, do you want me to say anything else before I introduce Professor? Perfect, good. Well, it's my pleasure, and I have to mean this because more than a colleague, he is a friend of mine, and I always say my Russian side of the family. We've known each other for many years. That's not the reason I respect him as a professional. He's probably one of the top scholars in Russia on legal philosophy and legal theory. And that is not an exaggeration. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Mikhail Antonov from the Higher School of Economics, Russia. And his talk will be about Hans Kelsen and the Soviet law. And for the ones who do not know, this Congress in particular is in memory of Dr. Maria Teresa Lopez from Argentina, Professor John Gardner from Oxford, and Eugenio Buligin from Buenos Aires University. Mikhail Antonov worked with Buligin for many years, and thanks to Professor Mikhail Antonov, Professor Buligin had the opportunity to be many times in Russia presenting his work. So I wanted to say that especially in memory of Professor Eugenio Buligin, because many of his work is right now in Russia, and it has to do a lot with Professor Mikhail Antonov. So Mikhail, that's me. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to stop talking. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jorge, for your warm words and for your brilliant organization and for your kind invitation to me. So, do you hear me well? It's okay? Okay. So the topic of my presentation is Hans Kelsen and Soviet war. Evidently, one can definitively say that Kelsen and the Soviet legal scholars evidently disliked each other. Kelsen, on the one hand, criticized the communist theory of war. It is the name of his book, The Communist Theory of War, published in 1955. And occasionally, he wrote also several critical remarks in his earlier works, mainly in German. On the other hand, all prominent Soviet legal scholars, such as Stuchka, Pashukanis, or Wyszyński, consistently rejected Kelsen's pure theory of war, considering it as an example of the bourgeois hypocrisy. Surprisingly, but all the parties in this controversy, Kelsen and the Soviet legal scholars, formally claimed to be positivists, on the one hand, and mutually accused each other of being disguised natural law scholars, use naturalists. And this seems to be their main strategy in the In the debate, if one could say that it was a debate, it's rather mutual accusations. So, and my question is, why did they choose this strategy? The main point of the Soviet criticism of Kelsen's theory was that he allegedly covered the factual conditions of class struggle and exploitation under the abstract normative language, and by this considering the war as a metaphysical thing in itself. So from this standpoint, the Soviet scholars also criticized the Grundnorm, seen as a kind of an eternal category, independent of the social and political conditions. However, in reality, this Grundnorm, well, in the opinion of the Soviet scholars, was based on certain political and social conditions of the bourgeois society. Kelsen was, in this sense, a false positivist and ignored the factual background from which legal norms stemmed. It was Pashukanis in as early as in 1923 who, in his review of Kelsen's two books on sovereignty and on the concept of state in German, accused Kelsen of standing on the natural law ground. Another classical Soviet scholar, Andrei Vyshinsky, wrote that Kelsen's theory was nothing but a capitalist morality, I cite, dictated by the political regime under which Kelsen had to live. And I continue citation, the weakness of legal method, here Kelsen's method is attacked, is that it plays with concepts and ideas instead of investigating the phenomena that lie beneath the surface of these concepts and ideas. Well, one can ask oneself whether this critical remark, or remarks in plural, be employed the other way around. I mean, against the Soviet legal scholars themselves. Absolutely, the doublespeak of the Soviet war about legality, justice, and equality in times of Stalin's purges had nothing to do with the reality about which reality in quotes about which the Soviet scholars wrote at that time. The Soviet lawyers also were shy to waver the discretion, the power of exception belonging to the party and its officials, with its proper name. For this evident, for quite evident reasons, scholars had to resort to a kind of a doublespeak informed by the Marxist-Leninist philosophy to keep their writings in line with the official ideology. From this perspective, for Kelsen too, Soviet scholars were false positivists because they ignored normative facts for the sake of a justification of moral and political ideas. It might be that treating Soviet legal theory as a natural law doctrine in his 1955 book, Kelsen just chose to beat back his critics with the same weapon. He hit the same nail, in fact, suggesting that Vyshinsky and others just sought to praise the Bolshevik political order and to provide the political regime with a legalist justification. In this book, Kelsen suspected the Soviet legal theory in smuggling morality and ideology to the wall, and by doing this, to create an absolute foundation of legal validity. With this, the Soviet legal theory, now aside, Kelsen degraded to a handmaid of the Soviet government. Further, Kelsen asserts that, I cite again, the social science is possible only under the condition that it's independent of politics. And naturally, here he comes to the criticism of the Soviet legal scholars for their hypocrisy, on their side again. Well, next question, does this mutual criticism of Kelsen and of Soviet legal scholars stand on a reasonable ground? I have some doubts about it. Well, I agree with Anna Lukina's analysis on weak points of Kelsen's positions vis-à-vis the Soviet theory. I'm grateful to Anna's analysis, on which I partly based my paper. And I also think that Kelsen was evidently wrong, treating the authoritarian legal ideology as a natural war doctrine only because this ideology was based on certain metaphysical assumptions. Well, quite many philosophical conceptions can be built on metaphysical assumptions, but not every of them would be properly classified as a natural war one. With this, one can ask oneself why finally did Kelsen choose this perspective and didn't criticize the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik authors, for what they could be really criticized. I mean, for disguising how the Soviet war really works and for utilization of the outdated legal methodology, that of the German Rechtswissenschaft of the 19th century. This conundrum seemed easy to be cleared. Well, apart from the question about the language knowledge, because Kelsen didn't read Russian. I think that Kelsen's small book on the communist legal theory was likely written without a real intention to engage in discussion with the Soviet authors he criticized. Many of them didn't live any longer in 1955, like Stučka, Reisner, or Pashukanis. The others whom Kelsen criticized, well, by that moment, had already considerably changed their initial positions because of the ideological shift I will speak a bit later. Apparently, Kelsen, in this sense, criticized the communist theory of war, which at that moment didn't exist anymore. Kelsen, in fact, targeted a kind of a revolutionary natural war theory in the style of Pashukanis or Stučka of the 1920s, while the actual Soviet theory in the 1950s, 30 years later, was rather similar to the, as I've already said, to the German legal science, to the German dogmatics, to the Begriff jurisprudence of the 19th century. The set of ideas that Kelsen, as you know, analyzed as early as in 1911 in his Hauptprobleme. In this sense, I find convincing the hypothesis of Miriam Gassner that living in the United States during the McCarthy era, Kelsen had to show somehow his loyalty to the libertarian values of his host country, and for this reason he intentionally misinterpreted the Soviet legal theory. This is a citation from Miriam Gassner. As a matter of fact, the 1955 book could also be suggested by John Hazard, simply a critical response to some ideas of the Soviet legal philosophers. I mean, the 1951 book titled Soviet Legal Philosophy. It was an English translation of the extracts selected by Hazard and by Bepper from the works of the Soviet legal scholars. And in some of these extracts, Kelsen's pure theory of war also came under the fire of critique. And the next question is whether Kelsen was really interested in writing this evidently weak book. I mean, the book of 1955. Even two books, because the first was the political theory of Bolshevism. And in this sense, the book on communist theory of war was in fact a sequel to this earlier 1948 book with a subtitle, A Critical Analysis, the political theory of Bolshevism, a critical analysis. Well, I think that Professor Olechowski was completely right in his assertion in one of the former panels of Jorge's platform in his speech when he asserted that Kelsen's early works in his early works one can find evident sympathies to socialist ideas, to the very ideas of to the very idea of Soviets, councils, in the sense of self-governing collectivities. It's another question whether Kelsen was really has really abandoned these sympathies, or just was forced to conceal them. The latter sounds to me more plausible. In 1953, interrogated by an FBI officer, Kelsen admitted that he was, I cite, a liberal socialist. A socialist, so in his own words. Nothing to wonder that to remove the suspicions of the witch hunters at the time, Kelsen tried to dissociate himself from his earlier socialist writings. The conclusions of these two books I've mentioned by Kelsen was rather superficial and similar to each other. Well, the main conclusion is that the Bolshevik political theory is nothing but an apology of dictatorship, and there is no war, properly speaking, in the communist theory of war, paradoxically. And this latter conclusion is not surprising at all, because natural war speculations use naturalism. For Kelsen didn't, in fact and in principle, didn't deal with the war properly speaking, so the positive war. So if it is true that the Soviet legal theory is a natural war theory, then it didn't deal with the war, and that's why this theory is not about war. So it's a simple syllogism. But was Kelsen right in this assessment? It's like it's look like that he was evidently wrong, deciding simply to summarize in these two books what he had written in German in the 1920s about Marxism and Bolshevism. And if there were good hits, good points on the conceptions of such Soviet authors as Reisner, Pashukanis, and Stuchka, hardly his Kelsen's criticism could be efficiently applied to the next generation of Soviet scholars. I mean, Strogovich, Gaunsky, Krylov, and others, whose approach was basically, with some exception, but basically it was positivist. So what Kelsen wrote about natural war tendencies could be right about Pashukanis, about Stuchka, probably, and evidently about Reisner, but not about the next generation. Willingly or unwillingly, Kelsen just overlooked the cardinal shift in the Soviet polity and ideology in the end of the 30s. I mean that the Soviets decided to dispense with the Marxist idea that the state and the war will wither away in a socialist society. So the Bolshevik Party came back to the standard methods of government in what Nikolai Timashev in his 1946 book called The Great Retreat, the book on the same title. And as Stalin put it in his thesis about intensified class struggle, the class struggle is intensified under socialist conditions, and the state grows stronger as ever before, needing the war for securing its control over the society. Well, in this sense, Kelsen's criticism in his book doesn't hit the Soviet theory of war after the 30s. In his 1923 book on socialism and state in German, Kelsen criticized Marx and the Bolsheviks for their evident inconsistency in their plans for the future socialist society. Thinking to eliminate the state and at the same time to keep up the system of coercive economic production. Well, Kelsen has persuasively shown that this organization would be impossible without the state. And as a matter of fact, I think that Stalin and Wyszynski and all this company would be ready to subscribe themselves to this Kelsen's thesis, because they did during this great retreat exactly the same. And the state and the war regained their crucial importance for keeping up the system of social control also in the Soviet Union. Well, and the orthodox Marxist lawyers like Pashukanis, who didn't match to this new ideology, were treated as enemies of the people for, well, in the exact formulation of the charges was for undermining the socialist state and war, and were exterminated for this reason. My supposal is that, as a matter of fact, both Kelsen and many of these Soviet legal scholars whom he criticized stood in fact on the same methodological track, but evidently had opposing ideological preferences, ideological objectives. The Soviet legal theory, and here I mean the theory of Wyszynski and his followers, in Russian legal parlance called the narrow theory of law, теория права. Well, on the one hand, and the pure theory of law of Kelsen, on the other hand, simply defended different opposing values. Those defended by Kelsen were the values of liberal democracy based on rule obedience. As to the Soviet theory, well, the disrespect of individual freedoms and communitarism. I mean, the communitarian social philosophy, the idea that the whole comes before its parts and is valued, should be valued more than its parts. Well, the old story dating from Plato and other enemies of the open society. Well, this was typical for the ideology of the Soviet war. Well, surely Soviet war was not alone in sharing such values. The same can be said about the National Socialist legal theory in Germany at the time. And perhaps one can be really surprised to see to which extent the NS legal theory, as described by Bernd Reuters and other authors, was similar to that of the Bolsheviks. It might be even seducing to suggest that there was a kind of exchange of ideas, or this circulation of ideas between the Bolsheviks and the NS legal scholars. For example, they all shared such points as substantial justice instead of formal justice, while claiming harmony of state and society instead of bridling the state with the law. Well, considering the law and the state as tools for accomplishment of certain messianic projects, both in the Soviet Union and in the Nazi Germany. Well, selective application of law to particular groups of the population, well, and many other aspects. So totalitarian and autocratic regimes, well, look like each other. It doesn't come as a surprise. But whether we can, with this, qualify the NS law and the NS legal philosophy as a kind of natural law, to take Frank, to take Schmidt, to take the other scholars who wrote at the Nazi time as natural laws. I think it would be an evident exaggeration. And for the same reason, it doesn't apply, this qualification doesn't apply to the Soviet legal scholars as well. After all, they described the process of application of law in the language which was typical for the positivist conception. I mean, the language of deductive reasoning. Well, making inevitable provisos about exceptions, like German authors, Carl Schmitt, or with such, well, different exceptions for Soviet scholars in interests of the working class, or the interests of building of communism, well, which the interest, the concept of the interest, which comes from hearing, which justify overriding the law in certain exceptional situations. And in the same language of interests or principles we can find also in other civil law jurisdictions. Well, the difference is naturally in the substance of the principles of interests and the way they are in fact applied. Soviet theory, the Soviet theory relied on the social sources thesis, rejecting the idea of supra-social sources of validity. However, the Soviet theory didn't accept the separation principle, the second cornerstone of legal positivism. Or surely one can say that it's not necessary. This second qualifier is not necessary is not decisive attribute of legal positivism, as there can be also soft versions of positivism that deny the strong separation. Well, and however, Kelsen takes this point for applying the qualifier of natural law to the Soviet legal theory. Certainly, he was right in stating that this theory intentionally left open certain channels through which morality could penetrate into the law. On the one hand, the Soviet law suggested to distinguish morals and the law. They were to be seen as a set of commands of the state, but at the same time the Soviet legal scholars suggested that there can be no clear borderline, no separation line between law and morality. Well, for perhaps quite evident reasons, because it was the Communist Party which was the voice of morality in the Soviet society, which could in fact override any legal provision when necessary. As the Brezhnev Constitution put it, the honor and the conscience of the epoch, честь и совесть эпохи. But if we look at Kelsen's theory, at his own theory, from the other side of the Iron Curtain, was it a true positivism? As mentioned before, already said, For his numerous opponents like Pashukanis or Wyszynski, not to mention others, Kelsen's theory was a hypocritical apology of bourgeois values. Well, as Wyszynski writes, in the garbs of empty formalism. Well, and in this sense, it was a kind of a disguised natural law theory. And you know, probably that in the West, there were also scholars like Alfros or Evgeny Bulygin, not to mention others, who claimed that Kelsen's theory was also a pseudo-positivism, because it allowed the idea of binding force of the law, and with this brought certain moral axioms, moral values into the domain of the law. After all, Kelsen himself had to agree in the 60s, in 1960s, this famous Salzburg discussion with his followers. I think that it was Voegelin who accused Kelsen of being surely there was a large criticism of Kelsen against Kelsen on this point, and the earliest work, I think, was as early as in the 20s, but it's okay. It's another question. Kelsen had to accept that his postulated Grundnorm was in fact a norm, but it was not a legal norm by its character. But still, it was the norm that was supposed to lie in the foundation of the legal order. Well, can we call it a moral norm? But it's still a separate discussion. One can probably argue that the mutual hostility of Kelsen and the Soviet legal scholars was not about the legal method, that of positivism, because they are more or less similar. Surely Kelsen's methodology stands on a much higher level of this methodological ladder in its quality, in its sophistication, but still the controversy was about objectives of legal regulation. Kelsen was seeking to protect human freedom. The Soviet thinkers were concerned how to use the law and the state for reaching some messianic perspectives like the bright future and so on, no matter what it would cost to particular individuals. So we have two sets of values, in fact. And it's not by chance that Kelsen was working really hard since 1940s on the problem of values. And just 2 years after the book on communist theory appeared, his famous book on justice, on equality and equity, called What is Justice? 1957. But the conundrum is that for some reasons, Kelsen didn't want to apply his analysis neither to the NS law nor to the Soviet law. I mean, the analysis of the analysis based on the values. As to each of theorists might be understanding by justice, by equality, and by other values. As to the theoretical analysis of the NS law, Kelsen remained rigidly silent, not condemning it, evidently we understand his human position. He was abhorred by the evil done by the Nazi criminals, but as a scholar, as a scientific figure, he didn't criticize the NSO. As to the Soviet war, Kelsen wrote two rather inconclusive books. They were inconclusive to my mind because they missed the central point of argument, the controversy about the final objectives of the legal regulation of the war. Why? Perhaps Kelsen didn't want to leave his is-out divide, which he considered as paradigmatic for every scientific research. Not only Kelsen. I think that both Kelsen and the Soviet legal theoreticians considered themselves to be positivists in the sense of being bound, of sticking to the is-out divide. And when Kelsen attacked the Soviet legal theory for letting values into the province of jurisprudence, he was right with it. And the Soviets were evidently far away from fidelity to this is-out divide. But still, the Soviet scholars were also right, claiming that Kelsen's Grundnorm and his entire conception was in fact conceding the values upon which this conception was built on. This was seemingly a discussion without issue. And it comes as no surprise that the both theory repeatedly accused each other for the hidden, disguised use naturalism. It could work, this kind of accusation could work as a way of mutual exclusion. I mean, if we assume that the positivist theory of war has nothing to do with values, with the natural war style of thinking, and if positivists and use naturalists were supposed to stand on different ends of the methodological line, then accusing an opponent of being a natural war, a partisan of natural law could work just to allow, just to get rid of the discussion, the substantial discussion. Well, what have I, a positivist, to do with the natural law thinking? Just thinking of different and speaking of different things. What, in fact, this argument, if we reconstruct it in this way, was evidently, was, in my opinion, I say it more humbly, was the main strategy of the both sides in this debate. I think that I'm ready with my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Spasiba. Plenty of time for questions. We have 20 minutes. Spasiba again, Mikhail. Where are you, in St. Petersburg now?
Yes, I am, yes.
Perfect, good. Yeah, I didn't know. We are open now to questions, answers, and comments. I don't know if anyone wants to say something. Of course, as always, I have my own comments and questions, but I'm conscious about the time. Any questions or comments, please? I can see Phil. Yes, Phil?
Hi, yeah. Mikhail, thanks for that. I had a question relating to Pashukanis specifically. I hadn't read Kelsen's book, so I wasn't aware of the nature of his engagement with the Russian theorists. But thinking about the earlier Pashukanis, especially the Pashukanis of the Allgemeine Rechtslehre, I can see why Kelsen would not be enthusiastic for the prospect of entirely replacing law and replacing law with technical regulation and so on. But the more analytical part of Pashukanis' theory, the idea of there being a sort of a deep homology between liberalism and the capitalist system and the forms of bourgeois law. You know, I've personally found that very, very enlightening and stimulating, and I would have thought that Kelsen would have been able to engage with that, and you know, there might even be you know, parallels to be drawn with the idea of you know, the historically first constitution and so on. Could you say a bit more about Kelsen's Kelsen's response to those aspects of Pashukanis' theory in particular?
Well, I think that Kelsen, Pashukanis was one of the main victims of Kelsen's analysis, not in the least because some of Pashukanis' works were translated into German, into the Western languages, so they were accessible to Pashukanis, unlike the works of just leaving. Well, Kelsen's theory was evidently about mixing is and ought, because for Pashukanis, war was nothing but the way of a commodity exchange, the legal form for commodity exchange. And in this sense, it was just a replication, just a reflex of economy, of private, of a capitalist economy. And the principle of Pashukanis' point was that in the socialist society, the one in which he lived in the 20s, there could be no war. So there could be no war as there is no capitalist mode of production. And in this sense, war has no value in itself. I put it very roughly because we are constrained by the time and I cannot go into detail, but very roughly, Pashukanis intended that war has no its own value, and it is not normative in its character because it doesn't oblige. There is no norm, a rule that oblige you. It's just you just enter into relations as a producer with a buyer, and you are constrained by this to certain way of behavior. And that's something that goes absolutely astray with the normative understanding of the world. And this was, the main incentive for Kelsen to criticize Pashukanis, along with his other ideas. And you have justly mentioned that for Pashukanis, his famous metaphor says that war must work as a clock. So just you enter into a relation. It goes somehow itself. You don't decide anything, and in this sense, we don't need even judges. We need people like it's a very utopian idea. We need doctors, we need machinists, just to change ways, but we don't need lawyers in the sense of making subsumption facts and the norm and decision and arguing, motivating. So we don't need it. This is for bourgeois society. It's not. Well, Kelsen couldn't combine this anti-normativism. So that's it.
Thanks.
And I see that there's a message of Anna. Soviet also tried to make a Pandoras Box objection when accusing Kelsen of being a natural war terrorist over state criticism. Different. Oh, yes, really. And I have especially read your paper once again yesterday evening before my presentation. I think that what you call Pandora's Box objection could be applied. could be applied, but it was not directly applied in the way you describe it by the Soviet legal scholars. They didn't say that if you open the open way for penetrating moral values into the law and for justifying the validity of the law by moral arguments, then everything goes. You can take anything. Because it would, to put it also quite simply, there was good morality and there was bad morality. There was socialist morality, communist morality, and supposedly this good communist morality was weighing in the foundation of the socialist law. It was not expressly said so, but it could be easily deduced from the style of reasoning. It was one of the many contradictions of the Soviet legal ideology. So I think that, as a matter of fact, the idea of Pandora's box could work, but in the sense that Kelsen's, in the eyes of the Soviet legal scholars, Kelsen's approach opened this box for the bad morality to penetrate into the law. But at the same time, it closed the doors closed the good box, the communist box for morality, which was the true morality and the true foundation of the good war, the communist war. So in this sense,
I would like to take this moment to introduce myself. I was supposed to moderate this session. My name is Jorge. I'm one of the three conveners. I would like to invite all the remaining questions that are on this really interesting presentation.
Jorge, if I may, can I make a comment or a question?
Yes, please, Jorge, and also and then Tomasz.
Just a comment because I like, Tomasz probably, but we had this conversation with Mikhail many years ago about sovereignty, because I'm, arguing about limited sovereignty, not absolute sovereignty. What is interesting from this presentation, because we talked about this many years ago with Mikhail, he talks about absolute foundation of legal validity. And he very clearly shows us, the Russian or Soviet, better say, Soviet understanding of what absolute foundation of legal validity means. And this is so important because usually in the West, we tend to see Russia and their claims about sovereignty, let's say Crimea or Ukraine, and we tend to assume the Western understanding of sovereignty. And I think Mikhail hit here a very important distinction between what Kelsen would have understood and what the Soviet law understood about this foundation of legal validity and the absoluteness within legal. So it's more of a comment because I don't want to take too much time, but very to the point, Mikhail, that absolute foundation of legal validity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tomasz, please.
Thank you. I have a more historiographical question, if I may, to because this is a question about the attitude or the nature of the critique of Soviet scholars when they engaged with Kelsen. And my question comes from reading Jerzy Wróblewski. Maybe some of you may know Jerzy Wróblewski as one of the most famous legal theoreticians of the second half of the 20th century. And he wrote a book in 1955. This has been for like 50 years, the major monography on Kelsen, the critique of the normativist theory of law and state of Hans Kelsen was the title. And obviously because of the times when he wrote it, this book is heavily loaded with ideological arguments, and you have like two layers though. One layer is very powerful, sharp critique of Kelsen's theory, which resonates in Polish legal theory up still, and it's well grounded, and I think it's very important. But then you have another layer of purely, ideological stuff, mumble, I would say. It's evident even if you go through his bibliography, there are several works of Lenin and Stalin quoted there. So there even was, I'm asking this because there even was an idea, maybe not a project, but an idea in Polish legal theory. Let's take Wróblewski's book, let's clear it of this stuff, and publish it again so it can be more readable for a contemporary reader. So I'm very curious because I just from the quotations, of course, Wróblewski quotes Wyszyński and other Soviet scholars. So only from his quotes I saw some fragments of what they wrote about Kelsen. And I'm curious about your opinion. Could you do the same in respect to Soviet authors of the same period? Do they have this critique of Kelsen, which you would say it's methodologically sound and point, and something that we could see as only to go through the censorship to get them published?
Thank you so much, Tomasz. It's really a very good point, and it is a good illustration to what I wanted to say, but probably didn't say explicitly. As a matter of fact, this this mutual accusation of being natural works prevented from the methodological debate. They just said, well, he is not a positivist. She just, something that, for Soviet scholars, natural law was, the Thomas d'Aquinas. so that's old Middle Ages. It is not even worth of requiring or analyzing. So I would say that the most, I think, the influential Soviet author was Professor Tomasz, who was also a very strong political figure. He was very active at the international level. He was also, I think, even the president of the IVR for some years. So he wrote several books with typical titles, bourgeois legal philosophy, the principle of legality in the bourgeois legal philosophy, and the Kelsen's theory was not, in fact, analyzed by its merits. It was analyzed mainly because in the light of its, let's say, ideological assumptions. Tomasz, unlike Pashukanis, didn't write that Kelsen was a natural law thinker directly because it was, I think, quite controversial. But the style thinking was that really Kelsen was just, one clown who was hiding cards in a sleeve and just saying, I'm for pure law, but as a matter of fact, he was hiding in his sleeve the cards were the liberal values. And the argumentation went just on this point, how Kelsen, and it was, I think it was true because Kelsen was a convicted partisan of liberal values, of liberal democracy. He didn't conceal it after all. So, and that everything in Kelsen's theory could be explained by his propensity to this liberal perspective. So it was the main line of criticism. And I think that maybe Wróblewski, I didn't read him, he was on the same side.
Thank you.
So I would like to invite any other questions in the last 3 minutes we have. So if not, I will use my dictator powers that has been invested to me by Jorge Núñez. I have one question, which is, I don't know if it's a fully fair question, but I would like to express it anyway. It's about, if any time like we hear the sociology of ideas that accompanies the ideas we study, I always try to think how is legal theory right now, and how legal theory are in this moment, and which lessons are there for the current standard of legal theory, in which we claim not, many people claim not to be influenced by their context, but the context shapes their idea. So I hope this is not completely unfair question. So what would be the takeout for legal theory today in our about this larger debate about the ideological influence that might have the context in which shape for legal theory, if there is any? So yeah, that would be my question.
Could you please repeat the point of your question, because I just was not following it.
No, so the point is there is a less. So this debates on sociology of ideas show that there is an important influence from the context about the ideas, that even those that tend to be merely scientific and not ideological, or at least this is how the debate is framed between the Soviet legal theory and Kelsen. And if there is a lesson to assess our own work today, the people working under oppressive regimes, or that claim to be free from those oppressive regimes, and if there is a lesson in these troubled times in which we're living, in which I assume there are also these both claims of purity from ideology, but also will claim that it's a representation of ideological claims. I hope I'm making sense.
Yes, yes, I fully agree with you, because you know, the big point of Kelsen's theory was the intention to put strict division borderlines between war and politics, war and morals. So, as a matter of fact, they don't exist, and I'm convinced, well, because it's my opinion, because you might have other opinions from other methodological standpoints. But my opinion is that we are always influenced in our judgments and in the choice of the methods we use in our arguments, well, by the polities in which we live, by the legal order to which we belong, by everything that constitutes our social experience. So that's it, and it's very common point that sometimes ideas are taken only on their face value. Just this is wrong. This is good, and this is wrong just because it comes from elsewhere, not from the United States, but from China, or from Russia, from elsewhere, and it doesn't fit our mentality. It doesn't fit our methods. So in this sense, I think what this set of ideas, this piece of idea means in its own context, and it might be, and it's well, it's nature to explain that this idea from the other context doesn't make sense in your own system of ideas, but just think of what it means in its original position. So that's it, and I fully agree with the comment.
Thank you so much. That was helpful. And just to close, Jorge Núñez has a quick commentary before moving to the paper.
Probably, and we didn't agree on this, but it was a coincidence, Jorge's comment and Mikhail's answer. Very soon, Springer will publish. We had the first ever Russian British Symposium on Sovereignty and Jurisprudence back in 2016, co-organized between Juris North and the Manchester International Law Center, MILC, at the University of Manchester. So the book will be published, and we have a paper from Mikhail, Professor Mikhail. It's co-edited by Professor Mariana Muravieva and myself, and it will be published later this year or next year. We've been working on this for almost 5 years now. And in parallel to that, we had a congress at the time, if you remember, Mikhail, in St. Petersburg. So we did 2 congresses in 2016. One in Manchester, 2 days, Manchester Uni and Manchester Metropolitan. And the third day was in St. Petersburg, again, back in 2016. And we are planning, we had a second one last year, the second UK-Russian Congress, and that's how we gather ideas together, because we work transnationally between Russia and the UK, and we've been doing that for at least 5 years. We had another one last year, 2020, that was Juris North. We were going to cancel, and we did it online. And I'm hoping with Mikhail, Professor Muravieva, Moscow and St. Petersburg to do something if we can next year, face to face. So thank you very much, because it was just a coincidence. We're about to publish finally the book. Thank you, Jorge. Gracias. And gracias. Thank you, Professor Mikhail.
So let's, before we move on, let's join again thanking Professor Mikhail Antonov for a wonderful talk. That's all. And thank you so much for participating in the conference. We really appreciate it. But we have a really packed agenda, and we have to move on. And I'm going to be now the moderator. I have the honor to moderate two papers. So this paper about the transnational exchange of ideas serves as a good introduction to the theme of our panel. We're going to be here for an hour and a half, discussing two papers, one by Tomasz Widłak about Kelsen's philosophy of international law, and one by me about monism in Kelsen. And they share this theme. What is one of the themes we would like to highlight from this seminar is the application of Kelsen to non-state legal phenomena, international, transnational, and global. The first talk is by Dr. Tomasz Widłak from the University of Gdańsk, and he will talk about Kelsen, Kelsen's project of international law and the project of the pure theory. He will be talking for 20-30 minutes, and then I will present, and we both together advance response whatever questions you have. We're working in this way because we believe that the papers have a connection, and we have organized them in such a way they have connection, and often papers are questions are directed to more than one individual. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Tomasz Widłak.
Thank you. I'll just try to share my screen. Yes, I don't know if it's working. Okay. I'll just try to, yeah, perhaps now. Okay, so hello, thank you. It's really a privilege and to be here, and I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for this this event. Rarely the topic of Kelsen and international law is there is not always there is much underlining of it and much stressing of this important issue. And my work with Kelsen has been primarily on Kelsen's legal theory. So I don't have a very packed presentation. I just have a plan of my paper, which I wanted to share with you, and I will be going through those points. So my aim here is to propose a reconstruction, putting together of what may be called Kelsen's philosophy of international law. Philosophy of international law as opposed to theory of international law. This, of course, requires conceptualizing this relationship between legal theory and legal philosophy, which I will try to do, of course, from the Kelsenian perspective. And I claim that, or my major claim is that Kelsen constructs his philosophy of international law in response to what may be called a teleological question. Teleological coming from the Greek word telos. So quickly going through the planning, what follows, I will offer the comment on the limitations, on the methodological limitations of Kelsen's pure theory in dealing with this teleological question. Then second, I will comment on a little bit on the difference between theory and philosophy of law. And then I propose this construction of Kelsen's philosophy of international law, which I will go through in more detail later on. So I start with the teleological question. What is the teleological question? Here I use to define this question, I use Wojciech Załuski's framework, some years ago, Wojciech published a book on evolutionary philosophy of law, where he claims that every legal philosophical current may be perceived as a set of well-worked answers to the 4 questions. The first question would be about law's ontology, the second about its methodology and epistemology, and the third, the normativity of law, and the last one on its teleology, or in other versions, axiology. So axiology is understood here as a theory of value. And this is a framework that many scholars, I think, would agree as to what there is in philosophy of law, or certain legal philosophical, theoretical currents. There is a lot of terminological problem here and linguistic problem, because if you say legal theory, legal philosophy, it means something else in English, in Polish, in German. So it's not that easy. But I will try to give it a look from the Kelsenian perspective. So now the theological question pertains to the goals of law, or its values, and how they should be realized or protected simply by law. So, for instance, this issue features out prominently in natural law tradition. So, almost whatever natural law school of thinking you take, there is almost always the idea of a just law, which is clearly articulated. And for instance, in natural law theories, this theological question dominates. Sometimes it dominates other elements. From the Kelsenian perspective, we have an impression, or many would agree that, well, this question is not answered at all, or at least is marginalized. In Kelsen, probably the methodological epistemologic question, or the answer to it, determines or dominates, is a dominant element in his whole teaching on law, or legal and theory and philosophy taken together. So what do we need this teleological question for when we characterize different philosophies of law? So basically, usually it serves the purpose that it gives ground to law. And I believe there are 2 kinds of answer to teleological question. So one kind is normative and another is factual. The normative kind sees the law as aiming at a kind of ideal of just law, or even justice itself. This is pretty much obvious, and such an answer, of course, serves a normative purpose. So, in other words, it explains why and how legal norms give reasons for action. But there is also a factual current that seeks laws literally. It seeks laws raison d'être. So it seems here that the law ought to be what the social facts demand of it. And that's also a version of answer to the teleological question. Of course, neither of the 2 is acceptable to Kelsen, at least on the face of it, because of his foundational methodological, epistemological assumptions, which I will not go through in detail here, because we all are familiar with them. I mean, those 2 major theses, the first one on separation of law and morals, and the second on the separation of is and ought, sein and sollen. So very briefly, the normative version to the answer to the teleological question is impossible for Kelsen, or hard at least, since the consequence of adopting the separation of law and morality is axiological relativism, okay, which he very clearly states, for instance, in this book or a collection of essays, What is Justice, which Professor Antonov mentioned. Second, the separation of is and ought bars, in fact, any consideration of law's necessary certain sort of entanglement with social facts, or any attempt on part of legal science to to search for what we would call, I don't know, imminent or primary reason for its validity. So, for instance, the existence of the legal order cannot be based on the maintenance of a specific social hierarchy, for instance, or a particular economic system. That would be impossible for Kelsen. So Kelsen, now going to the third point, theory and philosophy of law. Kelsen states very clearly on the very first page, I think, of the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law, when he explains the purity of his approach, and here quote, the theory attempts to answer the question what and how law is, not how it ought to be, end of quote, which we are all familiar with. So on the face of it, it seems that Kelsen is not interested in any speculative considerations about what and how the law should be, and also international law. These questions are dubbed legal politics in the Pure Theory of Law, but they are precisely the matter of law's telos, or axiology, or value which the law should perhaps promote or encourage. So to ask what the international law should be or aims to become is to simply pursue answers in international justice or philosophy of international law. This distinction between theory and philosophy goes along or follows the Kantian differentiation between theoretical and practical reason. So theory of law would be a discipline interested in law as it is, while the philosophy of law deals with law as it should be. And I think that Kelsen follows this track, actually. Of course, you may also try to separate theory from philosophy in methodological claims, along methodological lines. So theory of law would be the result of the normative method. But I think that this view is also very clearly visible in Kelsen. And just to mention that in 1926, together with I think with Weyer and with Weyer and with I can't remember, and with the third author, Kelsen started to edit the International Journal of Theory of Law, and there in the introductory article they very clearly separated theory and philosophy, and philosophy was referred to as and here a rough quote, justice, just, fair, natural, or absolute law. That's a matter of philosophy. And they clearly were not interested in that. So they put it aside from the scope of the journal. So now Kelsen's teachings on international law seem to constitute a notable proof, I would say exception maybe, but a proof that philosophy of law may be very tightly connected to legal theory, even the pure one, for the sake of its explicative and normative potential. That is why in my reconstruction of Kelsen's philosophy of law, I propose those two parts of it, the explicative and normative. So how Kelsen now builds this philosophy. He builds that philosophy in response to the teleological question, because Kelsen takes for granted the fact that the aim of any law, including international law, is to guarantee peace. And this is very evident in his writings on international law in the 1940s. And these are the primary focus of my paper in reconstructing this philosophy of law of his. However, he came with those ideas in his earlier publications. So first, there are arguments motivated by critical, reflective attempts to simply to explain the specificity of international law, well, against the background of general claims of pure legal science, and I refer to them as this first explicative philosophy. So Kelsen defines, let's see how Kelsen builds this peace thesis. He defines peace in a negative and minimalist way. Peace becomes a state of relative non-use of violence, and he makes it very clear that law can ensure peace in a relative, not an absolute sense. So he is trying to separate himself from any absolute vision of peace. So it's not a teleology aimed at an absolute value. Here, Kelsen would evidently contradict himself, but he doesn't do that. This is what he proposes in this peace thesis is a neo-Hobbesian argument, in fact, because Kelsen believes that as we know, the law is an organization of violence and means of a pacifying of community members. In case of international law, this will be members of the international community states. The goal is to avoid anarchy or anarchic law or anarchy of war of all against all. Only the organs of a political community acting on law are entitled to coercive reaction, are entitled to coercive interference in the sphere of interest of the members of the community. So this is necessary to maintain. So this is the primary aim for law, to maintain this universal relative peace, and therefore international legal order itself, and well, its existence depends on of course on ensuring peace by limiting and protecting the sphere of interests of states as the members of the community. So here we can see that even Kelsen denies this normative character. He denies that peace would be an absolute value, but he ends up in pursuing political philosophy as well. Because if you discuss this aim, then you pursue in fact political or legal philosophy. The fundamental purposefulness of legal orders opens the way to formulating the theory of their evolutionary development. This is what Kelsen does in the remaining thesis of this part. So the centralization thesis, the primitivism of international law thesis, and the analogy between international and national law. I will only refer very briefly to those major terms. So centralization, I will not go through Kelsen's theory of legal orders and what centralization precisely means, because he goes at length on that, both in the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law, but also in the General Theory of Law and State. And I'm sure that you're roughly familiar with this concept. His argument generally may be summarized as follows. Legal orders undergo an evolutionary development from primitive to advanced. The primary measure of the progress on this path is the degree of centralization. Second, international law should be classified as a primitive legal order in the early stages of development. And third, the development of international law progresses towards centralization gradually, in analogy to the development that modern state law has undergone so far. Centralization may be either static or dynamic. There are two aspects to it, of course. So in the former sense, the critical aspect rests in the territorial scope of the legal norms, and in the second aspect, the dynamic aspect, the centralization and decentralization of legal orders, relates to methods of creation and application of legal norms. Now, primitivism, well, I don't have time to go at length on primitivism. It's very interesting. I find Kelsen to be different, completely different than most other authors in legal theory and political philosophy, especially international relations. on primitivism and analogy. So he does not make any kind of political issue of it. He does not envisage the international law as something deficient, something related species of law. He does not do that, of course. He remains consistent. So primitivism is not understood colloquially, but only in relation to the degree to centralization and the relative lack of institutionalization that follows. The most characteristic feature of primitive legal orders for Kelsen is the institution of self-help, of course. So self-help, the historical example of self-help he gives, and he refers to it a lot, in fact, is the blood revenge during, for instance, a blood feud. That's a historical example of self-help, and he finds it to be present in international law to a certain degree. In his version of just war theory. Analogy, here Kelsen sees no reason why the international community and its law, international law, could not share in the progress and repeat the success story of the modern state legal order. International law is following the same pathway in terms of centralization as it advances. So he limits the analogy only to observe a general tendency to centralize primitive legal orders without prejudging the result. However, all of this would not be possible or wouldn't make much sense if not for the teleology of peace, if not setting this peace thesis as the aim. And now normative philosophy. Kelsen claims that the international legal order not only evolves towards more excellent centralization in this case, but also it should or it ought to. So he indicates, so the thesis is also normative. He indicates a specific way to accomplish this task, namely through judicialization. Judicialization, that's a strange word, but it means centralization of the process of judicial application of international law. So centralization and consolidation of international courts and tribunals. And this is the first part of the thesis. And the second is international individual criminal liability, international criminal liability of individuals, which also aims at the advancement of international law. So now I will focus on this normative philosophy, the first thesis on the courts. I think it's the most important. So why international law should proceed in this path? He gives at least two major arguments. So first, he sees that the fundamental problem is this anarchism of international law's application in specific cases. So states, as members of the community, at the same time are often acting as organs of this community. So they are both judges in their case, on the one hand, and parties to the disputes or entities whose interests may be affected on the other hand. So, and they themselves, they act on the community law. So, in fact, this is another version of self-help. So, no executive powers, no organs, relatively primitive, not advanced state, and this creates problems for Kelsen. Second, the problems of objectification. There's no objectification of the process of applying of law. The second argument why international law should proceed this way is that centralization is necessary to preserve the principle of legalism in the area of law enforcement. So what I mean here is that self-help can be ethically questionable because it leads to collective responsibility, absolute responsibility, makes authority of law directly dependent on the results of forceful solutions. So you can easily imagine state or a group of states acting as organs of the international community enforcing international law, but by means of power, war, and then they get defeated, right? So that creates, of course, the problem, I think, for the authority of law. Now, how Kelsen wants to do that? His postulate is centralizing the international adjudicative process, as I said, and he goes at length here explaining that, in fact, this is also supported by history. So in case of state legal orders, judicial power was centralized and institutionalized as the first one, earliest. Why? Because usually, especially primitive communities, they do quite well on the level of general rules creation. This happens usually by customary law. So you don't need assemblies that soon in the development of the legal system. They may come as the last point, one of the further points in this process of centralization of legal order. First, you need to have courts, because the existence of an independent legal order actually hinges on its ability exactly to objectify the process of application, so the process of determining the content of individual norms. So the problem is the translation of general law norms, customary law, into individual norms, into individual decision. Of course, I'm saying all of that having in mind that in the background, Kelsen's theory on the role of courts, which, as you know, Kelsen does not differentiate sharply and believes that courts, in fact, participate in the process of creation of law. That's a continuum, at least until a very last, almost until a very last point in executing a decision. Only after proper judiciary is in place, the way is often open to full development of other functions, like the lawmaking function and the executive, policing, administrative function. Now, how Kelsen, there are two very important points here, and I'm constantly trying to monitor time not to take too long. The courts and tribunals first have to have compulsory jurisdiction, so compulsory jurisdiction of a world court. So this is necessary. So suppose that one accepts the view that violence in international relations can only be legitimized as a form of sanction. Okay, that's the basic idea of there being a law. In that case, the logical consequence of the compulsory submission to every of your dispute between states, right, to an independent, impartial tribunal cannot be rejected. Okay, Kelsen believes that the state which does not agree to that disputes to submit those disputes to final resolution by international court undermines its credibility. Undermines its credibility in the support of the rule of international law, undermines its credibility in its support to the law of peace in international relations, simply. Therefore, the obligatory nature of international judiciary is a precondition for advancing international law further. And to that, Kelsen adds universal cognition. Okay, so we have compulsory jurisdiction and universal cognition, because compulsory jurisdiction has to be accompanied by universal cognition. So there are no disputes for Kelsen in international relations that are not international law related. Okay, so he opposes a lot this doctrine, which is, well, still it has its supporters, that there are some kind of disputes like political or economic disputes which are not international law disputes. So of course, Kelsen believes that international law encompasses all, and even if international law does not contain a relevant norm, it's also a result of something. So every dispute is legal. So every dispute should be within the cognition of the world court. And the last point, Kelsen sees the need to develop international law towards a significant extension of this criminal liability of an individual. And maybe I will just make one point that the principle of individual criminal liability represents simply a more advanced degree of implementation of justice for Kelsen. So than the primitive technique of collective responsibility. So even if the emergence of individual criminal liability applies only to specific cases, as we can see, then still Kelsen believes that it generally improves the technique of international law. And here I will not go through the historical context and Kelsen's support, but also later criticism of the International Military Tribunal and the Nuremberg trials. Maybe one just tiny comment here is that at one point Kelsen goes at great lengths, given his methodological assumptions, to well, weaken the rule that prohibits ex post facto criminalization, okay, in the context of the Nuremberg trials. So even he talks in one of his publications of that time, I think in Peace Through Law, that supposedly there is a widely shared immorality of specific acts at the time of their commission, and that is enough to criminalize them ex post facto. So he makes a case for crimes against humanity to come within the scope of the post-war trial. So that's a very far-reaching given his methodological assumptions. Conclusions. And now I go to conclusions. I think that there are four main conclusions. Why or what is the nature of this Kelsen's engagement in philosophical reflection? So first, it is not philosophy of law as a consideration of the nature of law, right? Kelsen does not do that. He doesn't have to make philosophical reflections on the nature of international law. International law is law, simply, and he does not have, contrary to some other philosophers, he does not have problem with that. He's very consistent. He's not interested in answering such questions. In contrast, his philosophy is pragmatic. On the one hand, he uses this teleological perspective to differentiate between legal orders, between the stages of the development, and thus to explain some specific selected features of international law. So that's the explicative part. And on the other hand, his philosophy of international law concerns itself with descriptive and normative reflection with a critical element. So what we would expect social philosophy at large is about. The result is that it adds perspective definitely to his theoretical findings that are the result of the pure method, right? Second, Kelsen would agree with this methodological claim, I think, differentiating between theory and philosophy in terms of this Kantian distinction of theoretical and practical reasoning, which I mentioned. And third, I think that Kelsen's philosophy of international law fills what some would consider a certain gap in his overall thinking about law. Kelsen shows that the answer to the theological question does not necessarily amount to providing axiological or value-based or factual foundation to the normativity of law. Instead, he uses this teleology of peace as an axiological tool, simply as an instrumental value that allows him to explain his theory of legal orders in a very concise way. And my last remark or my last sentence is that although theory and philosophy are separated methodologically, epistemically, they are at the same time inextricably linked and dependent on each other on primarily on argumentative power. And that was what I aimed to show, and I hope I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tomasz, for an excellent presentation that it has generated a lot of questions, and I'm sure it will give rise to important debates with the audience. And I certainly have a couple of questions to ask you because as I'm working in the same ballpark of questions about Kelsen. So, so after Tomasz, so just a quick reminder, we will continue with the second talk, and then we will have questions together for Tomasz and for me, because I am the next presenter. I would like to begin, first of all, by presenting myself. I am Jorge Luis Fabra Zamora, one of the conveners and also a provost postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law. And I'm going to present about, so before presenting, I would like to thank everybody in the audience. I haven't had the chance. It is wonderful to have this opportunity to discuss Kelsen at great length. And we have been here for 4 months, and always we have had an enthusiastic audience. And I'm grateful, and on behalf of Jorge and Gonzalo, we are grateful for that. And we always have had wonderful discussions, and I'm really looking forward to this. So let's go to the heart of the matter. I suggested a title. My title was Clarifying Kelsenian Monism. Once I submitted my abstract to Jorge, I say, but I am really clarifying Kelsenian monism? Because the idea of clarifying Kelsenian monism has this exegetical implication. I know what Kelsenian monism is, and I'm going to tell you better than what you know. But after doing that, after coming some reflection, I say, I am not clarifying Kelsenian monism. I am rehabilitating Kelsenian monism, but I want to be a bit more specific than that. I want to rehabilitate Kelsenian monism for what? For all purposes, is the best understanding of Kelsenian monism, is the best understanding of legal theory. And I could be a bit more precise. I am actually rehabilitating Kelsenian monism for transnational legal theory. That is the goal of the previous version I have, and this is the goal I have been refining. But I am not, once I reach this moment, I have to ask a really good question for myself. I am comfortable with Kelsenian monism, but how much Kelsen do we want to do? Do I want to transform this in an exegetical task about what Kelsen really meant about monism? Or is it something that we can call Kelsenianism, an understanding of the Kelsenian idea that is helpful? And I'm going to provide you perhaps a bit more precise. So I'm going to try to rehabilitate Kelsenian monism for transnational legal theory, possibly without Kelsen, but we will see. This is not a good title, definitely not catchy, definitely not professional yet, but this is the core intuition that I want to try to do. As you can guess at this moment, my intuition, what I'm going to present here, and what I really hope to get some of your feedback, is about the motivation and the core argument. The presentation is going to be quite informal in the sense that I'm not reading a paper. I have three different drafts in which I plan to present these ideas, and I haven't made my mind, so I'm going to provide it. And as it should be evident as well, this is not an exegetical claim. I don't want to suggest this is how Kelsen meant, and I'm going to provide a couple of reasons why I'm not doing that. So I'm going to call it a Kelsenian view that captures what I believe is the core central insight of Kelsen, but I don't mean to suggest that I have the best interpretation of Kelsen. I'm open to discussions. And here I believe I'm going to suggest what I believe is a way of doing philosophy. Is we stand in the shoulder of giants, but we don't want to see the same things that giants saw or do the same thing they did. That's an interesting project, get things clear, but I want to think other things with the same tools that Kelsen created, Kelsen and other philosophers created. So with this idea in mind, I am going to this is going to be my plan. It's a rather simple presentation. First of all, I'm going to tell you about the background and motivation of the project, why I'm embarking in this, and why it matters. Then I'm going to clarify what I believe is the central distinction that we could use and the core insight that I'm trying to expose in a coherent manner. And finally, why I think this argument matters. And this is what we can do in the 20 minutes of presentation we have here. So first of all, this is the background. So legal theory, and when we think about legal theory, we think about states, and we tend to think about states. If you think about law, you think about taxes, prison, and judges. And in many cases, the familiar answer is that law is equal to the legal system of nation state. Each of the countries you see here is a legal system. And this way of framing things frames our doctrinal inquiries. This is how lawyers work. All lawyers are lawyers of a country, pretty much, or a province, many cases. And this is how most of political inquiry until today. Rawls suggests that his influential theory of justice suggests that it's a theory of justice of some societies that are going to be close to national societies closed by borders and so on. While these have changed, still a great deal of theorization remains central in the state. And legal theory until today is centered in intramural debates about state law. So Harvey Dworkin, Harvey Fuller, Harvey others, and more derivations of these debates, ELP, and more sophisticated versions of the same ideas. And I don't want to criticize, those are really interesting debates. But will this happen? We also have this constellation of phenomena. We have this idea of interstate law, customary in the indigenous and religious. We have the international legal order, which is no longer a horizontal phenomena, but it's also centralized. Some people see constitutional elements, with some people find hierarchies. We have the idea of supranational law that at some moment was very important. It is defeated, but it's still operating in the European Union. But this is not the only regime. Something like the investment treaties are quite powerful. We have different forms of transnational law, like lex mercatoria, law of the internet. And some people say we have this global law, which is something really vague. But the idea is that there is a meta legal system or norms that regulate whole humanity and so on and so on. With all of this, if there is this constellation of phenomena, I think they matter, but they not matter just because they are there, or because people claim they are there. They matter because they regulate issues of critical moral importance for millions of people, and they couldn't be excluded from. This is William Trine's argument. Legal theory is leaving out a great deal of the things that it should be explaining, and these phenomena. International, transnational, global, regulate issues for millions of people, but also they regulate some of the central topics: environmental degradation, war and peace, refugee crisis. When Waldron says we should not focus only on those like hot topics, we should also focus on less exciting, philosophically exciting, like taxing, banking, phytosanitary, which are not under the control of the state. So if this is true, how do we explain what these phenomena are? And how do we explain the interaction about them? And in doing so, one of the questions we need to answer is, what is our role as legal theorists and practitioners in this globalized world, if we widen our purview? In my view, this is the central challenge, one of the central challenge, if not the central, of contemporary legal theory. And it is strange that people are focused on certain intramural debates when there is this plethora of phenomena, flourishing phenomena that we are left to explain. So here is why Kelsen. So analytical legal theory, the standard, the most important branches are quite state-centric. There are these two clear statements. Hart said that he will focus on the clear standard cases, which are modern states, and the other, international and primitive, are secondary. And they could be, you could read this argument as suggesting if we focus on the state, the other are just explained by consequence. Old Ras has changed his view, but old Ras in the authority of law, he suggests that only states are sufficiently important and distinctive to merit theorization. I don't think we find this debate in Kelsen. There are some appearances and there are some citations in which Kelsen seems to say something like law and state are coextensive and so on. But I believe that there is one way in which we can read Kelsen. There are many different ways in which we can read Kelsen. We have seen in this conference, but one way in which we can read Kelsen that we can see that he's not as state-centric as these other scholars. Here is one, as Tomasz just mentioned to us. International law is law for Kelsen, and he devoted, unlike other legal theories, Kelsen devoted substantial reflection to international law. He considered international law seriously. Kelsen also studied this idea of primitive law. He devoted a book called Society of Nature, and he was interested mostly in criminal issues, but he recognized in the general theory of law of state that there is something in common between the law, his examples, the law of the Ashantis and the law of Switzerland and United States. They are coercive and they are law. Kelsen also drew connections, and that's one of the key elements I want to highlight. He drew a connection between public and private law, but he also drew connections between the different kinds of law he interpreted. And here's the key insight I want to take from Kelsen, and this is why I want to rehabilitate him. Because Kelsen takes this seriously, this idea of the interconnectedness of legal experience, that international and domestic law and possibly have some kind of relationship, and legal operators and practitioners have to take this in consideration. So this is what I'm interested in this. Now, what is my argument? The argument of my paper is to illuminate. So first of all, this is why I call it clarificatory at the beginning, because I want to eliminate some misconceptions about Kelsen's transnational legal theory. This is why I want to bring clarity. But not only bringing clarity, I want to rehabilitate Kelsen for the purposes of transnational legal theory. And to do that, I want to clarify or present the idea of monism in a way that is capable to engage with contemporary legal theory and of the analytical kind. Working hard Russ and these people that are more prominent in the common law approach. So, and this is how I introduce my argument. One of the central questions is, we have all these phenomena. How do they interact? How do resolve disputes among them? And an important part of the literature, at least in the transnational legal literature, frame this issue in terms of monism and pluralism. Kelsen talks about monism and dualism. Kelsen was mainly interested in international and domestic law. We have recognized in literature more forms of law in traditional, transnational, global, supranational. So let's call it pluralism, because there is not only international law. And the idea is that there are many legal systems, and this idea of pluralism, and there are many legal answers. And they contrast this pluralism with the view that it is often attributed to Kelsen that there is, or there has to be only one. And while it seems to be that there is customary international, transnational, there is only one big thing. And this one legal system is the only thing that is studied. I want to suggest that this perhaps familiar reading of Kelsen is not false, is not accurate, because Kelsen has not suggested the claim of the sociological existence of one legal system. Kelsen allows for many different legal systems and international law. He's suggesting a claim of a different nature that concerns how do we apply norms. So it's not this claim as it's currently understood. It's something about how juries operate. So what did Kelsen say? It is a bit difficult sometimes to get what Kelsen said. So his view of monism as an epistemological postulate is connected to a particular very idiosyncratic view of validation and how norms are validated. There is this idea of the epistemological postulate. And there is this idea of nomostatics and nomodynamics in Kelsen. And monism could be read as but here we will turn our paper into a exegetical dispute. But however, as anybody familiar with Kelsen will notice, and most topics will could easily become purely exegetical. So Kelsen has numerous papers, almost 600 papers, and he changes views often, and sometimes it's difficult to get what changed, and there are numerous papers that simply track how these views change. Kelsen also comes with a lot of metaphysical baggage that people disagree. So you don't have to take the is-og distinction at face value to endorse monism, to endorse the insight. So, and I have the assumption that of metaphysical austerity, the less baggage, the better. But also there is a more pragmatic concern, which is that if we engage only in these concerns, we will not be able to engage properly with the other side of the analytical legal tradition. So I suggest a different distinction or a different way to approach. I believe that we are going we can reconsider monism if we consider a distinction between explanatory and doctrinal inquiries. These are inquiries this is a distinction I'm developing, drawing in the work of other people. I'm not claiming I'm the first one of drawing this distinction, but I believe that if we get it clearly, we can illuminate many debates in legal theory. So people have made this distinction about how to understand legal and normative phenomena in general. It is sometimes called theory of law or theory of adjudication, or sometimes theory of validity or theory of content. There are different languages, but the key idea is this. It is one thing to explain what a normative phenomena is. When do we have a family? When a group of people becomes a family? When money is money, or Bitcoin are money, or credit cards are money, or when an activity is a sport, or when a legal system is a legal system and not something else. Let's call this explanatory question. And there is another different question about how do we operate, or how do people who participate in these normative orders operate and play with these norms? And they apply them to different cases. It is one thing, for example, to know if soccer is a sport and when it's a legal system, for instance, but it's a different thing how referees should adjudicate disputes or call penalties or handballs and so on and so on. As trivial as this might sound, this is where legal theory has a lot of confusion. And this is a side note, but this is where hard-working disputes is confused. It is sometimes said that Hart developed a theory of law and Dworkin a theory of adjudication, but I believe both of them confuse both these explanatory and doctrinal questions. So Hart say, I'm doing a theory of law, and Dworkin is doing something different, but he actually introduced a theory of legal facts, of legal content, with the rule of recognition and so on, which moved from the merely explanatory to the doctrinal. And this is when at some moment they are talking past each other, and at some moment they are not engaging properly. But this is a side dispute. I believe this distinction between explanatory and doctrinal inquiry is actually central, and people like Kevin Toh and many others have tried to highlight how legal theory has made wrong turns by just avoiding this. But let's back to Kelsen. Here's how I will reformulate, at least for those in transnational legal theory. Kelsenian monism is not a view about the existence of many legal orders. It's not an explanatory view. It is a doctrinal view of how we proceed. And this is how legal operators proceed. So Kelsen is not stipulating that there is or has to be a legal order, but it's a doctrinal view of how legal operators and practitioners should proceed. But any any doctrinal account presupposes an explanatory account. And it's like any understanding of what soccer referees do presupposes an understanding what is soccer in the first place. That's the simple way to put it. And Kelsen has a view, which is not necessarily the view I would consider. I would suggest that in order to identify all this constellation, we have to go to the idea of political communities, and that what there exists in the world is a plurality of political communities. The state is a form of political community. The Roman Empire was a political community. The Incan Empire was a political community. International law is a different kind of political community. And all these transnational and transnational, supranational, and so on are forms of political communities, and we have to presuppose this. So my argument is going to be limited to political communities, and it's an assumption of what I'm going to say. So, and the best way to see the appeal of this Kelsenian monism, or this key insight of the interconnectedness, is to distinguish between explanatory questions and doctrinal questions. And I like to think of this from a very prosaic example. So we have one question: when a collective of people become a family for blood ties or other sorts of ties, that we can ask this question. But this question has to be distinguished from the doctrinal issue. Like mom tells the kid to do X, dad tells the kid to do Y. And there is a question at the kid as a practical agent that has to consider. What do I have to do if these two authorities that belong to the same realm of practical realm are telling me? And I believe the idea of monism, of the epistemological postulate, and this, which is one of the ideas of Kelsen, is that we have to consider them as all. It doesn't mean that there is a point of view of the family without recognizing that both mom and dad are practical authorities. And we don't have to deny that. I think this, as prosaic as it might sound, is the key idea. So there is a previous explanatory question. Are international, transnational, supranational law? So I'm saying, yes, they are political communities. But what happened? This is the doctrinal question that Kelsenian monism wants to focus. Is international law tells you X, or international human rights law tells you X, international trade law tells you X, domestic law tells you Y. What does the legal operator should do? And I believe that this is the insight of Kelsen. We have to operate from this epistemological assumption and work from a understanding of unity. So here is Kelsenian monism. Kelsenian monism is the unity of the legal content. All the norms that come from these political communities are to be thought as forming some unity. We do not have to deny that there are different legal systems, meaning Kelsen never denies that there are different legal systems in Australia, Canada, United States. What Kelsen seems to be suggested is that the content of this legal system has to be considered as a unity for those who participate in legal activities. And that's what I'm calling the unity of legal content. This view is supported, I believe, and can engage with analytical legal theory in this sense. On the one hand, it can engage with Ra's argument of authority because all these legal systems are practical authorities for us, and they will lose their practical value if we fail to recognize them. But on the other hand, it's compatible with Dworkinian interpretativism. And just keep the note, Dworkin has really, really interesting views on Kelsen. And I believe that these two views, apparently unrelated, are more compatible than they might seem prima facie. So just to conclude, why this matter? I believe this matters for two reasons. So first of all, it's a best understanding of law in a globalized world. So explanatory monism, which is the view that people suggest, because it's just false. There is no one legal system. And Kelsen did not suggest that. But doctrinal monism is an articulation of how current practice operate. I am a bit torn on this point. Is this a normative or a descriptive claim? So I want to suggest that it's a bit of both, but it's a normative claim of how judges should work in a globalized world. Some of you might rightly object that many countries do not endorse in this. Many countries act in a solipsistic way. Many judges say, we do our way, we don't care about international law at all. This is sometimes called American exceptionalism, which is famous. But what I'm trying to suggest, this is the best rational reconstruction of the practice. And if we want to understand this complexity of phenomena as a coherent, intelligible practice, we have to endorse something like the monism I'm suggesting. And finally, the most important is the consequence for adjudicator and jurist. So this is how I think is the jurist of the globalized world should act. So a monism, and each of us have to recognize some weight in our practical reasoning to directives, to those international and transnational that regulate, international, transnational, supranational legal phenomena that regulate our cases. And in a nutshell, the key insight of Kelsenian monism is a criticism of parochialism or solipsism. We are not alone in the world, and the jurists should operate in this way. So thank you so much. I believe I have taken just the right time. I believe this is of interest. Just a quick note, Gonzalo and I, two of the co-conveners, have recently arranged this beautiful book that I would like to, we are really proud of it. We were supported by Jorge Núñez a couple of years ago. It was just recently launched by Springer, and I just have received my copy today, and I'm really happy about it. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this interests you. So because I have the dictator, so the powers of the moderator, I'm going to open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. And for all, we have 29 minutes for questions and answers.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? This is Carlo.
Yeah, we can hear you, Carlo.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a problem with the video, so sorry. I just asked the question. I really appreciated. Hello to everybody, and thank you for everything. I really did appreciate your presentation and the previous presentations. I have a question, however. I totally share the idea that, of course, there must be a global dimension of law, according to your presentation and the previous presentation following Kelsen. But then I have a problem. Most of the critiques, and definitely there is a global dimension of, let's say, morality. So there is a global dimension of normativity. But I have a question, which is not a critique, is a question. Well, but then, like legal globalization or the legal global dimension is strange, very flat thing, like, globalization, financial globalization, economic globalization, the McDonaldization of the world, things like that. While, of course, one of the intriguing aspects of the legal method is the interaction between the component part of this very complex global system. In a way, we can use the word glocalism, legal glocalism. Of course, there is a global dimension that is interdependent with the local dimension, right? And this is particularly true in law, where, we have so many different anthropological, geopolitical, and you name them, differences. So how, you or the previous speaker would accommodate this problem? Or how Kelsen would accommodate that, if he could answer, since you have been studying them.
So there are 2 points. So I'm going to assume the question is directed to me. So there are 2 different points. One of them is about what are Kelsen's views, and the second is whether they are helpful to understand the world. So, and here is one thing. The world in which Kelsen live, it's somewhat different from the world in which we are currently live, and many of the phenomena that we currently discuss did not even appear to Kelsen. So Kelsen was mainly focused about international law, and this was the term transnational law was not even it did not even exist a great deal of during Kelsen's time. So this is the first part. So some of the Kelsenian tools might have these limited tools. It's like using, I don't know, apologize me for this strange analogy, like all 19th century regulations concerning carriage and applying it to cars. So it's something similar, but they were not created for those things. However, the key insight that there are moving things that are fast and that are dangerous is something we should respect. I hope the analogy holds. But the second thing I want to highlight is that you have highlighted a key dimension of this, how the juris in the globalized world should operate, and that allows me to clarify a bit which are the motivations of my talk. One of the things that I'm not saying is that judges should consider everything that exists within their application just because it's there. One of the strengths of the arguments as I'm shaping it is that there is a distinction between explanatory questions and doctrinal questions. And many of the doctrinal questions about how do we proceed is quite parochial, in the sense that each legal practice defines the terms of its interaction to others. And one of the points I want to highlight is that many of our contemporary states have gone crazy about accepting, signing treaties, making international commitments, but then saying this is not part of our law, and then making all sorts of qualifications about that. And sometimes like signing treaties or becoming part of these international agreements, and then not even recognizing their existence, it strikes me as a very problematic view. And here the idea that you suggested of globalization is one interesting way to think about this. We have to be jurists in the global dimensions, but we always remain rooted or embedded in a particular context. And we have to, what I'm trying to suggest is that we have to recognize its double nature. We work within a context, but we also have to look to the world while involving in our legal practice. I hope I'm a bit clear, and I hope that helps a bit.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have Rubin and Gonzalo Villa.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. To Professor Tomasz, I have a question. First, I'm really sorry, my terrible English. I'm not sure if you can understand my point and my position. And if you're not, just forget about it. So my question is the separation you made between theory and practice, or theory and philosophy. And you said that Kelsen made this separation, theory and philosophy, and this separation is based on Kant's separation between pure reason and practical reason. So you're right about this. Kelsen made this separation between pure and practical reason, but I'm not sure if this is correct in terms of Kantian philosophy, because the pure reason in Kant, also practical reason, are both theoretical works, because practical reason in Kantian terms is also a pure practical reason. So both are theoreticals. So the first one is about what science is, or what knowledge is, and the second one is what moral is. It's not is and out problem in this situation. It's just is, and what is moral and what is philosophy, what is science. The philosophy in Kant, it's in it's a different part of his groundwork. The philosophy is above both pure and practical reason. Philosophy is the transcendentalism philosophy, and this transcendental philosophy grounds or bases both pure and practical reasons. So my first question, what do you think about this? Do you agree with Kelsen, the fact that exists this difference, and what is the, I don't know if you could repeat, what is the relevance of this separation between theory and philosophy in Kant, and also in Kelsen theory? This is I don't know if you can understand my position.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, you're right. The claim is here not to be very exact on exegetic on Kant, of course, nor in fact was Kelsen, because, as you know, well, on the one hand, Kelsen was inspired by neo-Kantism, and there's a lot of neo-Kantism, especially in his first period, in his methodology, when he speaks about the unity of knowledge and of method and the object of this knowledge. But I don't think it's a simplification, of course. So maybe I didn't make this, didn't have time to make this explicit, that this is a kind of, it's probably an overuse of Kant. It's a simplification which is quite prominent, in fact, in modern jurisprudence. So if you can find it in German books on Rechtsphilosophie, right? And for instance, in Polish legal philosophy as well. So it's a far-reaching simplification. It's a kind of an analogy, maybe. The claim here is absolutely not that we take Kant very to his letter and translate it. So it's not philosophical in this way. It's just just a kind of yeah, I would say a kind of a analogy just to introduce this distinction between how the law is and how the law should be. Now, it's all in a sense theoretical. Okay, so you're right when you refer to Kant, and for Kant it's all theory, and we may say that here as well. Because, for instance, I was alluding to that language problem as well. If you take, for instance, the English terminology, and you say international legal theory, right? So people understand under international legal theory, they would understand. I think so in the common law culture or the English-speaking world, they would understand both the elements of theory and philosophy was defined here. So it's this is one point. Another point is that it's by no means strict. You cannot separate theory of law from philosophy of law. That is impossible. So that distinction I made is conceptual. I think it roughly can separate the answer to what I defined as the answer to the teleological question from the considerations that are the result of the pure methods, which are the result of this answer to the methodological epistemic question. And that's all. But by no means here we want to separate. It's impossible. Even if you look on the titles of works, books, there is a tendency right now to conflate those two. So, for instance, very often you have the titles. My own book on Kelsen, referring to his teachings of publishing Polish. Okay, so there's no title in English, but I would translate it as I use them both terms in the title, theory and philosophy of law, because in fact you cannot separate them. So this is only meant as a certain conceptualization, just to work those things separately, but not to suggest. I was trying to show that in the end they are inextricably linked together. And even if Kelsen, shies away from directly from the question of axiology or answering in a strong way to the problem of teleology of the telos of law, he actually does that somehow because he cannot leave that aside when explaining, especially when explaining international law. I think international law is simply a good example because of the primitivism of international law, according to Kelsen, that he more visibly introduces this element. So my aim was only to show that this answer to the teleological question is somehow present in a way, and name it as philosophy of law, because I can see analogy between what this Kelsen's answer is and what he wrote, separating the two. So basically, I don't know if that answers your question.
So we have two comments, one by Adil Jaque, Professor Adil Jaque, one by Gonzalo. But Gonzalo just told me that it seems that Tomasz wanted to say something to the previous questions, and I didn't notice. And I'm sorry if I didn't notice. If you want to say something in response to Carlos' question.
No, maybe just shortly I can comment that I see this. Well, in contrast to Jorge, I think I would go further. I think that the Kelsen, in my view, is not that well. You can read him quite direct, and it's still of much relevance to the global law we have today. I see this connection. I think that his theory of legal orders is quite universal, and you can simply separate the notion of legal order from the notion of state easily. And you may envisage the landscape that everything is somehow connected. Whether this link is epistemological only or not, it's another question. But everything is linked, and I think that by terms of legal orders, you can explain even the phenomena we see today. I would use a different metaphor. For instance, the Kelsenian metaphor of pyramid is somehow this image we have in mind as a problem here, because it doesn't fit. But if you think about it as a, I don't know, a web or a galaxy, for instance, Jorge had a very good image. That's a very good metaphor I also used in one of my papers. I agree with that. And you have this encompassing legal order, and you have regional concentrations of more centralized legal orders, like you know, states or some other even transnational orders or international organizations that are those bright points, you know, those concentration of stars in the galaxy. So that is also a metaphor you can use, and I think that I would defend. Don't have time. Don't want to take too much time, but I would defend the view that Kelsen is still relevant for that, pretty much.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. I think we're talking like a similar language, and I see a couple of faces nodding, because if we get rid of the pyramid and we think we're more creative, we have more opportunities to rethink Kelsen. And I like the idea of a web or a constellation. So I'm really glad. So Gonzalo suggested that I should read first Professor Ali Hake's question. So Professor Hake asked me, and I will always ask Tomasz about Dworkin's view. So you mentioned Dworkin's interesting view on Kelsen. This reminded me of Dworkin's essays, comments on the unity of law doctrine, which distinguishes between Kelsen's theory of legal science and his theory of legal reasoning. Do you broadly agree with Dworkin's readings of Kelsen's? And my answer is yes, I agree. So Dworkin has got some fame that he's an uncharitable reader of others. This might be true in some cases, but it is certainly not true about Kelsen. These comments on the unity of law doctrine, if I don't recall wrongly, is a paper he wrote in commenting harsh criticism of Kelsen. And here it's one of the, if I don't recall this wrongly, it's one of the first appearances of the distinction that I'm trying to use. Dworkin distinguishes between sociological questions and doctrinal questions, and he said the sociological questions is quite uninteresting. The doctrinal one is the one I'm going to focus, and this is why jurisprudence is a preparation for judicial decisions. So I not only believe Dworkin's an accurate description. He cannot say Kelsen is sociological, because Kelsen is clearly non-sociological. So he formulated clearly in terms of a theory of legal science and the theory of legal reasoning. And okay, I not only agree with this, but I will also want to say something further, that Kelsen, or these ideas of one system view between law and morality, are somewhat influenced by Kelsen. So Dworkin is somewhat a Kelsenian, and that's a really strange claim to have. But someone who has been working on this topic is Tomasz Bustamantes. We have discussed this issue at greater length, and I believe that there is a case to be made about some Kelsenianism in Dworkin's. So I don't know if Tomasz wants to say something on this point.
I'm okay, I agree.
We have Gonzalo now.
I have just a small two questions. The first one is related to the Kantian influence in Kelsen. We have this big influence in pure theory of law, of course, but also in international law. And Tomasz make a point that is very interesting about the peace as value. So my first question is for Tomasz. How can this introduction of this value make the theory of Kelsen less pure than the first version? I mean, that the original version of pure theory of law. And the second question is for Jorge. It's more from Dworkinian influence. It's about the distinction between explanatory and doctrinal explanations. I mean, it's like the always problem of the chicken and egg, between the distinction between epistemological dimension and ontological dimension. This epistemological dimension at the end becomes into a ontological dimension through, for example, judicial decisions. So it's possible to say that if you apply this model to Kelsen, you are changing the nature of the aims of the Kelsenian theory. That is the question.
So Tomasz, please.
Yeah, that's a hard question. That's thank you very much, Gonzalo. That's I think at the heart of the problem. I'm not quite sure if Kelsen struggles, but he evidently tries to. Well, he sees the problem because he declared peace as a sort of absolute value or intrinsic value. I would use that that distinction. Then he would obviously that would pose a problem in the face of his axiology of his position on axiology, so that there are no absolute values. So in pure theory of law, he writes even very, very clearly that even the value of peace is not the thing. Even you cannot, and he makes a discussion that he says, for instance, even now today, writing back then, he says there are some people who would say, you know, that war is maybe something which appeals to virtues and which trains your virtue, a kind of Nietzschean outlook. So he says, so you see, even peace is not something that everyone would agree on. But then in reference to international law, he actually, he obviously needs peace, although clearly as an instrumental law, I think. So, well, I'm just trying to put together both things and everything he wrote about peace. And I think that the only solution is to say that simply peace is instrumental value. So Kelsen would not probably exclude instrumental values that serve a certain purpose and are limited and relative. And whether this makes his view impure, I would say that maybe it would make his view impure in his first period. So when he wrote his first book on international legal theory, the problem of sovereignty and the theory of international law, there probably more so. At least I think so, because there he is. Then you can see that the influence of Hermann Cohen, for instance, very clearly, or he almost refers to that. I don't know if that answers your question, if you agree with me.
Thank you so much, and I wish I had as good as an answer as Tomasz has expressed right now. Gonzalo has raised a really interesting point about the distinction and the compatibility with Kelsen's overall project. And I'm going to say just one thing in response. I believe that getting this distinction between explanatory and doctrinal issues is one of the key tasks of legal theory, not only explaining the transnational legal phenomena, but getting this distinction right. The explanatory or sociological, as Dworkin calls them, or quasi-sociological, as I believe we should call them, it's one set of questions, and the doctrinal is another set of questions, and there is a third set of questions. How do you explain the relationship between both? Because you cannot ask explanatory questions. So let's move away from Kelsen. Let's think in heart. You cannot ask the explanatory question if there is a legal system if you don't have somewhat a doctrinal account of how judges are, because you need to recognize judges. You need to recognize, and this suggests that there is a presupposition that there are doctrinal questions in practice. So there is no, so and one simple way to say it is egg chicken, or which one goes first. They go together, but one is different from the other. That would be my view, but I know this is not Kelsen's view. So Kelsen would be trouble with this kind of account. For me, it's no problem. So I am a Kelsenian. I don't want to rescue Kelsen's view, and I want to take out some of this metaphysical baggage. Is all distinction. I don't think. I think if we follow like blindly the principles, we will not move far. So we can just get this from our boat, put it out. I have no problem doing that. Some Kelsenian purists will be problematic, but it's not a concern for my project. I'm just using this insight. At least I believe I can do it consistently, and I hope I can show that. But of course, there is also the exegetical dispute. But I don't want to fall. I'm happy just avoiding it. So I have one question. There is no point for Tomasz about his interesting presentation on Kelsen's on the two sides of the story, and I think we only have time for this. So Kelsen suggests that the fundamental instrumental value of international law is peace. And he suggests that the way this is achieved is through judicialization, is through creation of justice. Kelsen's understanding of peace is negative peace. There is the absence of war. But there is a cynic, I can follow Kelsen's argument, but there is a cynic response. It's like, so you're going to resolve war with judges? And what are these judges going to apply if there is no legislative power? So if there are no norms, there is only treaties or customs. And is this sufficient to avoid the scourge of war and all the horrible things that happen during wars? So that would be, is there a simple answer to this like cynic challenge?
No, I think Kelsen, at least as I read him, at one point he pretty much says something like
c'è la virgola, nuovo paragrafo, grazie, abbiamo già risposto noi, punto esclamativo. Nuovo paragrafo, cari saluti e buonasera.
Ciao, Carlo, if you can mute yourself. Carlo, please.
Okay. I think it's okay now. He writes something like, well, you have to start with something. Okay, so this is actually what his critics back then.
Hello?
What his critics back then really actually raised, right? So, well, but Kelsen says, no, well, it's a vicious circle, so you have to start at some point. And he provides arguments for that judiciary. You start with the judiciary because this makes the most sense in the advancement. Of course, he supports it with historical argument on the analogy to the development of state legal order, but I think he has a lot of point here that the judicialization, through judicialization, you can do it. But there is also the second element, the individual criminal liability. So he also sees this because sometimes we read it only in the context of his doctrinal views on international criminal law and the Nuremberg trials. But in fact, I think that at a deeper level, he tries to show that this is also the way of going forward. So of course, you will have wars, you will have legal wars and illegal wars, which he very peculiarly gives the name of just war, which is, you know, it uses a lot of argument because there's a just war theory, and that is simply not what Kelsen means. But he uses this just war rhetoric. It's a legal war, in fact. So he distinguishes that sanctions in law, and it shows that the life of international law can be, at least for the time being, pretty much undistinguishable from just Hobbesian war against all, of all against all, right? So it's a matter of law which gives meaning, of course, to this or that. But gradually, you will have progress if you institutionalize and centralize more of the judicial power, and you bring war criminals to trial. We have to remember that that was also in the particular point in history. So he made most of those crucial arguments in the 1940s, I think. But not to see Kelsen as an opportunist, we must say that this is a little booklet from 1934 on the international legal order, I think, published in London in English, and there he clearly makes those arguments at least 10 years before. So I think he remains pretty consistent on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tomasz. That helps a lot. So we're going to have a break, but Jorge Núñez will explain a bit of the rules. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thank myself on behalf of. So it was a wonderful session. So we are a bit late for break. So Jorge Núñez, please.
Perfect. No, thank you very much. Gracias, and thank you all. Very briefly, we'll start the break. So Gonzalo, get ready the music. We'll have about 28 minutes break, and then from Colombia, we'll have Dr. Andrés Botero Bernal. He will be joining us just in a few minutes. And then we'll continue with Carlo from Italy, Carlo Garbarino, and Asia Ostrowski from Barbados. Thank you, Asia, in particular, because Asia has been a star. She's been with us all three roundtables, and very early today she was joining us, despite of the time difference, from Barbados. So I want to acknowledge that again. So again, without any further ado, and tomorrow, please stay with us, because Phil, one of our authors, will be talking about this same issue, and in particular Lars Binks, our first keynote tomorrow. He deals with this interrelation between national law and international law. So just, to mention that. Gracias, Jorge. Thank you again, Mikhail. Spasiba. And thank you again, Tomasz. Gonzalo.
Nothing.
No, the music.
Oh, please.
Yeah,
Okay.
you are our musician. I'm going to stop recording.